Spoilers, they be about the place. The Crow is a film that is steeped in sadness, not only through its story or the tragedy surrounding the making of the film, but also around the creation of its source material. The 1989 comic The Crow by James O'Barr was conceived and created in order to help him deal with the grief of losing his fiancée in a car accident. Just from looking at the pages of the book, one can tell that O'Barr poured his heart and soul into it with the beautiful illustrations of a doomed couple's romance as they become engaged, but also see his outburst of anger at the loss of his own fiancée when Eric and Shelly are killed by a gang one violent random night, only for Eric to rise again from the grave and take revenge on those who carried out the crime. The book would go on to be a massive success and inspire millions around the world, and its story would eventually lead to a film adaptation which would further push its story into the mainstream, but also would sadly lead to its own tragedy when its lead actor Brandon Lee was accidentally shot and killed while on the film's set. It's a film that not only is remembered fondly as a great comic adaptation, but also as a cautionary tale of the dangers that can come with filmmaking. But it's also a film that is widely celebrated around the world and is one of the most interesting comic book films ever put on screen. So join me now as we put on some face paint, listen to a spot of The Cure, and find out what makes The Crow a great movie film.
The devil stood and felt how awful goodness is. You felt how awful goodness.
Our movie film begins on the 30th of October, the Divils Night, where we find Ernie Hudson as Officer Albrecht investigating the murder of Eric Draven and his fiancée Shelly Webster, who is slowly dying at the scene of the crime. The cops are clearly terrible at their job as they let this little girl called Sarah get right up to Shelly as the poor woman is dying. It turns out Shelly and Eric would look after Sarah, so it is a bit weird that she isn't more emotional after seeing all this.
She's my friend. Her and Eric.
Albrecht tries to comfort Sarah, but sadly Shelly joins Eric in being #dusht. It's 1 year later, and while leaving flowers at Eric and Shelly's graves, Sarah sees this crow getting thick with Eric's grave, as it's just smacking the shit out of it like a right prick. But this does cause Eric to wake up from the deep sleepy time he's been having, and burst right out of his grave. He's a bit confused as to why a big feckin' bird woke him up from his sleepy time, so he goes wandering off around the streets. But while all this madness is going on, across town, a couple of bad lads are wrecking the place. And after making out of there with their score, they make it go fucking boom! I feel like they didn't have to smash up the place if they were just gonna blow the feckin' thing up anyway. Well, Eric manages to stumble his way back to his old apartment, where he finds his old cat, Gabriel, and touching him causes Eric to have a flashback to the night of his murder. Usually when I pick up my cat, all she does is fucking claw me. We find out that the lads from earlier were the ones who killed Eric and raped poor Shelly. And this flashback to his own death is so intense, Eric does some gymnastics out the window and lands superhero style. And he discovers he's feckin' Wolverine. Meanwhile, the bad lads are celebrating by swallowing some bullets. Jesus, that will wreck their arses on the way out. I wonder if one of them farted hard enough, would it just go off in their arsehole? That would leave a serious mess for someone to clean up. And clearly, these lads are not going to be the masterminds behind the film. Yeah, a bunch of idiots right here. Back at the apartment, Eric is having a ton of flashbacks about Shelly and gets so upset about it all that he just busts a perfectly good mirror. And while listening to a spot of The Cure, he turns himself into every goth's wet dream. One of our bad lads called Tintin is over here in Gideon's pawn shop trying to pawn some rings he has stolen. But little does he know when he leaves the store that the crow is watching him and leading Eric right to him. So after a spot of parkour and a swan dive off a building, followed by a bit of a laugh, Eric finds Tintin, who is not one bit worried about this random lad in face paint coming up to get thick with him. The two of them start busting the head off each other, but Tintin gets cocky and he's like, I'm feckin' unreal with knives, so let me show you how it's done. I mean, come on, that was pretty easy for him to dodge. Now that did take a spot of skill. And with that, we say goodbye to Tintin.
Victims, aren't we all?
Later on, T-Bird here goes and meets the Candyman himself, Tony Todd, to tell him that they blew up the place earlier and to let their boss Top Dollar know that they did an unreal job. Why does everyone in this film have such a strange nickname? Why can't it just be like Tony? Tony the Robber. That'd be great. But this Top Dollar is a nasty man altogether, as he's upstairs doing all sorts of weird shit with his sister. Eric ends up paying the local pawn shop lad Gideon a visit by putting his head right through the feckin' door window. But Gideon is a terrible businessman and doesn't know how to make a sale at all.
I'm looking for something in an engagement ring. Gold.
You're looking for a coroner. Shit for brains. Oh, shit. Oh, shit on me. Shit on me.
Well, Eric is not in the mood to shit on him, so instead he just beats the fuck out of him and demands to know where the rings Tintin pawned are. Speaking of Tintin, he be dushed as fuck, and Albrecht is thinking fair play to the lad who did this. And they also drew a lovely picture of a crow as well. Eric manages to find Shelly's ring, and after finding out that T-Bird and the boys hang out at a bar called The Pit, decides to let Gideon live. Although that doesn't stop him from blowing the place to fucking bits. Albrecht shows up to the explosion and is the least trigger-happy cop ever. He just thinks this lad is a nutjob and decides to get Eric to have a bit of a sit on the footpath. But Albrecht isn't a great cop either and looks away long enough for Eric to disappear like a ninja. Later on, Sarah, the daft ass, while crossing a road, forgets to look both ways and ends up getting saved by Eric. And something Eric says allows Sarah to figure out who he is.
Can't rain all the time.
Eric?
Clearly this lad has never been to feckin' Mayo in the west of Ireland. After leaving Sarah confused as hell, Eric goes upstairs and finds her mother Darla, who happens to be the girlfriend of one of the bad lads called Funboy, who is high as a kite.
Oh, man, don't do that. You nearly gave me a fucking heart attack.
Funboy wants Eric to leave, but Eric is having none of that. So Funboy decides to shoot Eric in his clearly fake hand, which heals no bother at all. He keeps shooting Eric until Eric makes him shoot himself in the leg. Eric decides to help Sarah's mother by getting the drugs out of her system with his magical powers, and says, here, would you stop acting the tit and be a sound owl lady to your daughter? Darla legs it out of the bar downstairs, where Candy Lad and Gideon happen to be drinking at. So Candy Lad goes up to investigate what's going on, and finds Funboy dushed, and sees Eric just fly right out the window. But that lad isn't fazed by this at all, cause he loves doing that too. Later on, Eric goes and scares the bejesus out of Albrecht at his house.
Freeze! Don't ever do that, man.
Albrecht allows Eric to see his memories so he can see what poor Shelly went through as she died due to having stayed with her the whole time in the hospital. As Albrecht is a sound scan like that. The two of them seem to be forming a bond, and before leaving, Eric gives him some pretty good advice.
You shouldn't smoke these. They'll kill you.
Gideon, meanwhile, is having an awful day, as after his shop being blown up, he's now being held at sword point by Top Dollar, who wants to know all about Eric. But even after spilling all he knows, Top Dollar decides to make Gideon #dusht. But Top Dollar is also one impatient lad. A bit of overkill there, I think. Across town, Skank and T-Bird are getting some essentials.
Smokes and road beers, be quick.
So Skank goes in to do the shopping while T-Bird hangs out in the car. But while Skank gets the supplies, T-Bird has someone waiting for him. Eric brings T-Bird on one seriously messed up joyride, wrecking the place, which ends with T-Bird going right off a pier and going, fucking boom! And Eric leaves the crow signal behind, just so everyone knows it was him who did it, and not Batman. The next day, Candyman is checking out Eric's grave, and is like, fuck, this lad is actually dushed, but up and about the place. Albrecht, meanwhile, is getting chewed out by this detective lad for protecting Eric, which ends with him getting suspended. See, this is why you don't be friends with goth lads. They get up to all sorts of devilment, and you end up suspended. Sarah, being the smart girl that she is, has figured out that Eric is back, and finds him at his old apartment, and the two have a heartfelt reunion. Anyway, Skank tells Top Dollar and Candy Lad about T-Bird being blown to bits. Well, he's trying to do that anyway. This lad explains the story about as well as a drunk Irish lad.
Flash T-Bird to his fucking car. Oh, T-Bird, it's you, buddy.
Later on, Eric decides that the best way to get battle ready is by blasting out a killer guitar solo and then just wrecking it. That was a very random scene. That night, Top Dollar and his boys are having themselves a bit of a house party on Divils night. But Eric crashes the party as he wants to make Skank all sorts of dead.
I just want him.
But good old Top Dollar is having none of that and refuses to give Skank up.
Kill him.
I mean, surely it couldn't have been that easy.
He's gone.
No idea how that lad didn't see Eric under the table, but anyway, it leads to a pretty cool shootout. Eric totally lays waste to these lads, and it's kind of gas that they never explain how he just knows martial arts. I guess the Crow just watched a ton of kung fu movies and gave him the knowledge, and when you have the son of Bruce Lee in your movie, you kind of want him kicking some ass. After killing everyone, Eric finally gets a hold of Skank.
Guess it's not a good day to be a bad guy, huh, Skank?
What a skank. That skank right there. Skank's dead.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work, Skank. But the cops burst in with the strangest way of saying halt.
That's all she wrote. Move and we shoot.
That's not how you're meant to say that. Eric runs away from the cops and this whirlybird on a terrible green screen before taking a swan dive off a building. But 'tis grand because Albrecht is here to save his ass. But then the ungrateful little shit just legs it away.
I knew you were gonna do that.
Meanwhile, Top Dollar, his weird sister, and the Candy Lad figure out that if you kill Eric's crow, you also can kill him. Yeah, they just kind of just seem to know that now. I guess it's because Top Dollar's sister is just a feckin' weirdo. Anyway, with Eric's work done, he goes back to Shelly's grave, only to find Sarah having a spot of sleepy time there.
You're gonna say I shouldn't be in a cemetery in the middle of the night, right?
Safest place in the world to be.
What kind of graveyards has this lad been hanging out in? Every other movie film says stay out of them at night. The zombies could get you. Eric says goodbye to Sarah and decides it's time for him to go back to dusht. But, of course, Sarah ends up getting kidnapped by the bad lads. Eric's crow sense starts to tingle, and he comes to save Sarah. But the Candy Lad feckin' shoots the damn bird, which ends up leaving Eric totally open for an attack by Top Dollar. I'd probably be crying after being shot, not reacting that calmly. Candy Lad goes to finish off the crow, but in comes Albrecht like the champ he is. He busts a cap in the Candy Lad's ass, but Top Dollar's weirdo sister has gotten hold of the crow. The two of them form a plan, and Top Dollar gives her a gun, and then the shift. Jesus, lad, that's your sister, you sick fuck. Anyway, Albrecht ends up getting shot in the gut, while Eric goes up to this nutjob, who is obsessed with eyes. So the crow says, fuck you, you bitch, and pecks her feckin' eyes out. And then she falls all the way to her death, making her #dusht. Eric confronts Top Dollar at the top of the church, and after dropping Sarah, the two have a feckin' sword fight in the rain. The fight is fairly even until Eric decides to be a good lad and tries to save Sarah from falling off the church, which allows Top Dollar to sneak attack Eric from behind. And then he decides to be the villain and just reveal to Eric that it was him all along.
What happened back there with you and your girlfriend? I cleared that building. Hell, nothing in this town happens without my say-so.
But Eric wants to thank him for this information.
I have something to give you. I don't want it anymore.
Well, you are fucked now, lad.
30 hours of pain.
After suffering through all of Shelly's pain, Eric drops Top Dollar right off the church, and he lands right on a spike, becoming #dusht. Eric says goodbye to Sarah and Albrecht and goes off to finally be with Shelly, and the movie film is dusht. Now, this is a film that has huge nostalgia for me, as I grew up in the 90s and noughties. I have an older sister who was a goth at the time, so a lot of my love for horror films comes from the two of us watching them together. But another big film that would often get played in our house was The Crow. So before I get into the good and bad of the film, just know that I've always had a massive fondness for this film. I think that the first thing that has to be said about this film is that it shows what a huge loss Brandon Lee was. I've only ever seen him in Showdown Little Tokyo besides this, and while he's pretty charming in that film, it's here in The Crow that he gives a truly star-making performance. I really believe if that horrible accident hadn't happened, he'd have gone on to have had a very successful career throughout the 90s and early noughties. The supporting cast is great here as well. Ernie Hudson as Albrecht is great here and helps give an emotional weight to the film with his connection to Sarah and then Shelly's death, and is there as a guiding presence to all the characters in the film. Michael Wilcott as Top Dollar is also great. His voice just suits a villain. He comes across as pretty threatening and is given just enough background to be a pretty interesting character in his own right. I think everyone else in the film is bringing their A game here, and they really capture the characters well. I mean, you have David Patrick Kelly and the Candy Lad himself, Tony Todd, about the place in this film as villains, so you know you're getting some good bad lads in it. The film also has a great gothic noir look to it. This world feels lived in and feels grimy as hell. It doesn't have the overly clean or CG look that modern day superhero films have. Being made in the 1990s, this had a lot of practical work involved in it, and that has allowed the film to hold up pretty well all these years later. later. I also feel that this film is one of the best examples of the whole person is attacked or killed and comes back to avenge the wrong that was committed against them. It's so simple and effective that it just works. It has a great pace to it, and you never feel like Eric is just moving on from each villain to the next, as each action scene or moment with them is different than the one before it. I also love the score to this film, as it really captures the tone and vibe the film is going for and drives all the emotional scenes in the film, giving it a real sense of weight. And the soundtrack is great too. I personally love the Cure song Burn that is used to great effect in it. But let's move on to the bad. I honestly don't have a lot of negative things to say about this film, but one of the big things that doesn't hold up is the small use of CGI. It isn't used a ton, but when it is there, it really sticks out like a sore thumb, as it doesn't mix well with the other visuals. I'm sure the film has many faults when you look at it closely, but right now my nostalgia glasses are on, and I can't think of any other negatives with the film, but I'm sure I'll be told a ton of them by someone. It is a shame though that Hollywood never learns to leave things alone, and much like my beloved Highlander, they decided to create sequels to The Crow. It was another perfect one and done story, never needing to be continued, but once you have a hit on your hands, I guess it's always going to happen. So we have 3 sequels, all of which aren't that great and come nowhere close to the original. A very 90s TV show that wasn't that good, but does introduce some interesting stuff to the mythology, while also giving us Mark Dacascos kicking some ass. And now there is a reboot coming out. Will that be good? Only time will tell, I guess, but I doubt it will have the lasting appeal the original has had. The Crow is one of the most visually interesting, emotional, and captivating comic book adaptations there has been. While its source material is a strong, impactful story, the film takes it and elevates it to something more that is truly worth your time, especially if you were a goth or emo back in the day. So I give The Crow 4.5 out of 5 Horshes. So what do you think of The Crow? Do you enjoy it as much as I do, or do you think it's just a goth's wet dream? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time when we horsh into another movie film.